This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 665 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. As you can tell from the title of this episode, I'm going to be talking about bold predictions today. Every year, I really try my best to be reasonable with these bold takes. I don't want to just fire something off that doesn't really make any sense, just to say I told you so if that thing comes to fruition by the end of the season. These bold predictions are, at least to me, I think they're logical. They're reasonable. They're looking at the range of outcomes of players and saying this realistically could happen if certain things go a certain way. So in turn, some of the predictions that I talk about today aren't going to seem as bold as some predictions that you read or listen to elsewhere. That's just not my style. But they still will hopefully make you think about some players a little bit differently. Now, I'm going to talk through 10 predictions on today's show. But if you subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football newsletter, you'll get an additional 5 of them into your inbox on Tuesday morning. And that newsletter is totally free. To subscribe, just go to lateround.com and click newsletter. Now, before getting to these predictions, I want to remind you about the Establish the Run Draft Kit. Establish the Run has rankings for any fantasy format you might be playing in, and they continuously update as news breaks. You also get access to Evan Silva's top 150, and along with it, a change log that you can read to see why players are moving up and down his draft board. It's a great way to make sure you understand why players are ranked where they are. The goal is to help you make better decisions, not tell you who to pick. And if you're into best ball drafting, their strategy, rankings, and insight can help you out a ton with roster construction. Establish the Run gives you a different perspective on fantasy football than I do, and I think the combination of my work and theirs can help make this draft season a successful one. So head over to establishthерun.com, purchase their draft kit, and when you do, use promo code JJ for a 10% discount. That's promo code JJ. Also, just a reminder that the Week 1 NFL Sunday Million is officially live on FanDuel. Showcase your NFL knowledge and construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap. Then follow along using FanDuel's live scoring feature to compete for your share of $3 million in cash prizes. That includes a cool $1 million to first place, all for just $4. The first Sunday of the NFL season is approaching quickly, so head to FanDuel and submit your lineups today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first bold prediction is that Rhamondre Stevenson will score 40 more PPR points than Damien Harris. This one's bold because Stevenson often gets drafted after Damien Harris, though that's been flipping a little bit over the last couple of weeks. But here's why this will happen. If there's one high ceiling player in this New England backfield, it's Rhamondre Stevenson. It's not Damien Harris. We saw Damien Harris find the end zone 15 times last year. He still finishes the RB20 in PPR points per game. That's because he had a target share of 3.6%. Even when we prorate for games missed, Harris's target share was still below 5%. That was a number exceeded by 60 running backs with 8 or more games played last year. Rhamondre Stevenson is a bigger-bodied back who can catch passes. We saw him do that at Oklahoma, and there's already hype surrounding his pass-catching ability in camp. Now, there's a chance that we see Ty Montgomery take on the pass-catching running back role in this New England offense this year. And we know that that's been a role that can be fantasy relevant. We saw that with James White for years. But what if a large chunk of those targets go Rhamondre Stevenson's way? And what if Stevenson, who's a bigger-bodied guy, like I just said, sees more early down work too? Then all of a sudden, we have a really good fantasy season for Rhamondre Stevenson. Wan'Dale Robinson will outscore Kenny Golladay. This one's bold because according to Fantasy Pros aggregate ADP, Robinson is going 22 wide receiver spots below Kenny Golladay. I think this could happen though. Kenny Golladay has not done anything substantial in the NFL since 2019. He's going to start on the perimeter for the Giants this year. Wan'Dale Robinson's going to be their slot guy. Robinson was a top 3 slot receiver in college football last year according to PFF. And he had the 7th best score in my model, in my prospect model, within this year's receiving class. He should start right away in the slot. And the Giants in this new regime, they drafted Wan'Dale Robinson in the 2nd round. They gave him 2nd round draft capital. And if you look at Brian Daboll's offenses of late, Cole Beasley had prorated target shares of 23%, 20%, and 19% over his last 3 seasons in Buffalo. So the combination of Galladay's question marks alongside a really underrated Wan'Dale Robinson profile, that makes this prediction, I think, a reasonable one. The third bold prediction is that Diontae Johnson will finish as a wide receiver 3. This one's bold because Johnson is consistently being drafted as a wide receiver 2. And in a lot of drafts, he's drafted as a higher end wide receiver 2. Now, I think Diontae Johnson's a very good wide receiver. I've talked about him favorably for years on this show. And we should generally buy talent at wide receiver in fantasy football. But situationally, I'm just a little bit worried about Johnson in this new Steelers offense. Over the last 2 seasons, only Tampa Bay has thrown more passes than the Pittsburgh Steelers. Johnson's seen a really good target share over the last 2 years. It was 27.5% per game last year. It was 23.6% the year before that. So he's seeing high target shares on a team that's been throwing the ball a lot. That's resulted in the 4th highest target total of any wide receiver in the NFL over the last 2 years. The Steelers are almost definitely not going to be as pass heavy this year. And that's going to naturally lower Johnson's volume. But what if whoever's under center isn't peppering Johnson the same way that Ben Roethlisberger did? Johnson's average depth of target ranked in the 24th percentile among 50-plus target wide receivers last year. And that was largely because the Steelers ran an offense that surrounded the idea of getting the ball out quick. With a more mobile passer and hopefully a better offensive line, what if that changes a little bit? What if that allows players like Chase Claypool and George Pickens to develop more plays down the field? And this isn't to say that Johnson's incapable of doing that. It's just saying that there's good competition alongside Johnson right now, who can also do those things. I think Johnson's a great wide receiver. This is a redraft take and not a dynasty one. But I think there are some concerns for fantasy purposes. The next bold prediction is that Trey Lance will be a top 3 quarterback. This one's bold because Lance does go in the top 10 in best ball formats, but aggregate ADP has him at QB 13. I think this could happen though because he's the quintessential late round quarterback target this year. We want rushing from our fantasy quarterbacks. He brings that element. In his 2 starts last year as a rookie, he ran the ball 24 times. He scored 14.6 and 19.1 fantasy points in those 2 starts. But in one of those starts, he was about a centimeter away from scoring a rushing touchdown. And for some context, his 12 rushes per start last year, that's more than what we've seen from Lamar Jackson during his career. And yes, I am fully aware that this is a tiny, tiny sample size. We should not make these massive assumptions based on just 2 starts. What I'm saying is we do have evidence that Trey Lance will run. And this Shanahan system is a good system. Jimmy Garoppolo, a player that no one wants right now. Jimmy Garoppolo was 2nd in the NFL last year in yards per attempt. They've got 3 great receiving weapons in Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, and Deebo Samuel. And they have a good run game too. To me, Lance has the same type of overall profile as a quarterback that Jalen Hurts had entering last season. The difference, though, is that he might have better arm talent. And not only that, but his weapons and his surrounding supporting cast is a lot better than what Hurts was working with last year. And we saw how Hurts did in fantasy football. So Trey Lance, I do think, has top 3 quarterback in his range of outcomes. The next bold prediction, Chris Olave will be the highest scoring Saints wide receiver. This one's bold because Michael Thomas's ADP is skyrocketing, and he usually goes well ahead of Chris Olave. But here's why this could happen. We haven't seen Michael Thomas play in a regular season game since December of 2020. He was playing with Taysom Hill at quarterback, and Drew Brees started that season under center for the Saints. Now he's more than a year and a half removed from an ankle injury, and Jameis Winston is his quarterback. There's a lot of volatility there. Thomas's last 2 completed seasons, 2018 and 2019, were his 2 really, really big ones in fantasy football. During those seasons, he had an average depth of target of 8.2 and 7.9. He saw 15-plus air yard targets at about a 6th percentile rate. Jameis Winston is an aggressive passer who generally takes shots down the field. In 2021, before his injury, he was 9th out of 37 qualified quarterbacks in deep ball rate. This favors Chris Olave. Olave had 4.39 speed, and he's likely going to be deployed as a deep threat. And he's good. Only Drake London had a higher prospect score in my model this season out of that wide receiver draft class than Chris Olave. Michael Thomas might see more volume in this offense, but if Olave makes enough splash plays, he can outscore him. This next bold prediction, it's pretty bold, but it's a fun one. Juju Smith-Schuster is this year's Cooper Kupp. This one's obviously bold because Smith-Schuster's not exactly an early round selection, and Cooper Kupp is coming off one of the best wide receiver seasons of all time. I don't actually think that we can project a 1,900-yard season from any wide receiver, let alone someone like Juju Smith-Schuster. But there are some interesting similarities between these two wide receivers and what's going on this season. Last year, Cooper Kupp had a big quarterback upgrade and was being drafted in the running back dead zone. He'd already played 4 years in the NFL, averaging a slot snap rate per season of 64.9%. And he had been productive. He had given us multiple wide receiver 2+ seasons. Smith-Schuster is entering the season with a big quarterback upgrade while being drafted in the running back dead zone. He's already played 5 years in the NFL, averaging a slot snap rate per season of 69.4%. And he's been productive throughout his career, giving us multiple wide receiver 2+ seasons. Juju fell victim to the aforementioned Steelers offense that didn't allow big plays to develop down the field. His average depth of target was just 6 yards during his last healthy season with the Steelers. But his peripherals looked fine. His catch rate on deep balls remained pretty consistent year over year. He just wasn't seeing those types of targets as frequently. So I think that if there's someone who fits the Cooper Kupp profile this year, it's Juju Smith-Schuster. Kenneth Gainwell will outscore Miles Sanders. This one's bold because Miles Sanders goes well ahead of Kenneth Gainwell in fantasy drafts. But this could happen. Kenneth Gainwell looked really good in both my prospect model and my year 2 model. He finished his rookie season with a 10.8% target share. There are only 2 other running backs since 2011 that during their rookie season saw a 10% target share and fewer than 100 rush attempts. Those 2 running backs outside of Kenneth Gainwell were Nyheim Hines and Tariq Cohen. Both of those players were effective moving forward. Tariq Cohen had an awesome second season, and Nyheim Hines has become one of the best pass-catching backs in the league. But I think that Gainwell actually has more early down upside than those 2 running backs did. Miles Sanders has been inconsistent throughout his career, and even just last year, Gainwell had a better success rate. So if reports are true that Gainwell has a shot to see high leverage situations, I could see this happening. Elijah Moore will finish as a wide receiver 1. This one's bold because Elijah Moore's ADP isn't close to the top 12 at the position, and the Jets have more competition for him with Garrett Wilson there. I just think that this can happen because I feel like the fantasy football market doesn't fully realize how good Elijah Moore was last year. He entered the league with a 96th percentile prospect score in my model, and he ended his first year in the league with a 97th percentile rating in my year 2 model. And get this, half of the players who hit a 95th percentile rating in that year 2 model end up with at least one 18+ PPR point per game season in either year 2 or year 3. That's since 2011. That's what we've seen historically. And maybe that won't be more, but those are some really, really attractive odds. Moore also hits a lot of the things that I've talked about with middle round wide receiver breakouts. He's the first pass catcher being drafted from his team by ADP, and he's a second-year wide receiver. And guys, over his final 7 games last year, he was averaging 17.7 PPR points per game. That shows us that he has a very good ceiling. There's a very real chance this offense won't be able to support Moore as a true wide receiver 1. But I do think it's possible. Chase Edmonds will finish as a top 15 running back. This one's bold because even though Edmonds has seen his ADP rise a bit over the last month or so, it's still not close to the top 15 at the position. But I'm very intrigued by Edmonds. I've been drafting Edmonds a lot. He played the first 10 snaps of Miami's second preseason game this past weekend, and he should have the receiving role locked up in that backfield. And I also think he's just an underrated runner. Last season, among 50 running backs with 100 or more carries, Edmonds was 4th in percentage of runs that went 10 or more yards, and he was 17th in percentage of runs that went 20+ yards. He was also 2nd last year in yards per carry, minus his running back teammates' yards per carry. To put that another way, he was significantly better than James Conner in yards per carry. He's had target share per game rates of 13.2% and 12.3% over the last 2 seasons. We should feel good about him having that receiving role. And he also received a good contract this offseason. That's not everything, but it should make us feel a little bit more bullish on him. So I think Chase Edmonds is an underrated asset right now, and he could finish as a top 15 running back. Now the last bold prediction, Christian Kirk will outscore DK Metcalf. This one's bold because according to Fantasy Pros aggregate ADP, Kirk is being drafted at wide receiver 43, DK Metcalf wide receiver 19. But I do think that this could happen. The downside argument for DK Metcalf is pretty straightforward. The Seahawks have the worst quarterback situation in the NFL right now. Metcalf was fine with Geno Smith last year if you want to look at those splits, but he scored 50% of Seattle's offensive touchdowns during that time. And his target share per game was actually lower with Geno Smith than it was with Russell Wilson. Metcalf's an awesome player, but situationally, things do not look great in 2022. Meanwhile, Christian Kirk is a fifth-year player. We've seen those fifth and sixth-year wide receivers do well in the middle rounds of fantasy drafts historically. He also should be deployed in the slot a good bit in Jacksonville. And that's huge for him. In 2021, Kirk played 78% of his snaps from the slot for Arizona. That was by far a career high. He then came through with another career high in yards per route run, finishing just behind Terry McLaurin within that statistic. I'm currently higher than the market with Christian Kirk, and I'm lower than the market with DK Metcalf. That's what this one really comes down to. I do think that Christian Kirk can absolutely outscore DK Metcalf. But those are the 10 bold predictions. Again, you can go subscribe to the newsletter over on lateround.com and get 5 more in your inbox tomorrow morning. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Make sure to check out lateround.com to join the Patreon, check out the draft guide, and again, subscribe to that newsletter. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.